welcome to this evening's meeting. For those of you who are in the room, you might get fed up with looking at the back of my head occasionally, actually on Zoom as well, because the camera's in front of me. But the Zoom screen currently is behind me on the presentation, so I do get the bad habit of looking around at it, so apologies in advance if I do that too many times. Firstly, can you all hear me well enough in the room? Right, so if anybody on Zoom can't, then please do let Elaine know. What, I'm too quiet? Or do you think that was just because of that feedback? Asking. Okay. Asking if you're having these now. If you're still a problem, then let me know. Thank you, Elaine. Elaine, as you can see, is hosting tonight, and I'll be doing the usual introductions. I will do my best to remember to get everything right this evening. That's a big ask, actually. I apologize to anybody who was watching on Zoom last time. I forgot to unmute the speaker after the break. So I have now got a note in front of me that says unmute in very large letters. And I'm hoping that Elaine or somebody will pounce on me if I forget again. It's kind of necessary to unmute the speaker, really, isn't it? Here. Anyway, we will get started then. Just a few announcements before we go to our speaker. Our next indoor meeting is, of course, in 2 weeks' time, which is the photographic competition. You have 2 more days when you can send in entries. It closes at midnight on Friday, the 3rd of March. And there are, as I'm sure you know, 3 categories. So there's portrait, flight in action, and birds in Berkshire. I think this is the first time we've had birds in Berkshire. We're really keen to get more local photos in. We're hoping that if we get suitable ones, then we may use them in the future in publications and publicity. So please do have a look at the website if you need to know where to send them. Jane, our secretary, is organised it this year. All the details are on the website. The next 2 outdoor meetings on the next 2 Mondays, so that's Monday the 6th of March and Monday the 13th. The first one is to Leap and Calshot, and the second one to Pennington Marshes, both organised by Bob Lyles and both in conjunction with the NODOC. And I'll just pass over now to Bob, who's got a few other words to say about that.
Yes, good evening. It's just to say that on the outdoor programme, there is a long weekend coming up in Kent. It didn't appear on the slides here because it's still a few weeks off, but I do actually need to set a cut-off date because it involves booking accommodation. So could people who are interested in this trip let me know by the 17th of March, that's a couple of days after our next indoor meeting. We did a similar weekend to Kent a few years ago, and it was quite successful. We saw a load of birds, hobbies, red-footed falcon, nightingale, and I'm sure going at this time of year, in the middle of May, will be absolutely brilliant in Kent. So please let me know if you're interested by the 17th of March. Thank you.
We'll also just briefly mention the new programme of outdoor walks that we're having, the introduction to Berkshire birding near Reading, which is starting. The first one's on the 25th of March, which was on one of the slides. Again, if anybody wants information about those, the first one's at Padworth Lane. I've got information here, plus there's more information on our website. Right, we also like to announce the forthcoming meetings for some of our local groups. We welcome everyone, and they're very kindly advertising our meetings. So we can do is reciprocate. The RSPB Wokingham and Bracknell's group, their next indoor meeting is on Thursday the 9th of March, so that's a week tomorrow. It's Colin Wilson on the birds of the Blackwater Valley, and that's in Finch Hampstead. And their next field trip is on Saturday the 11th of March at Greenham Common. If anybody wants information about contact details for any of these, see me this way. Then the other RSPB local group is Reading, of course, and their next indoor meeting is on Tuesday, 14th of March, on Egyptian Adventures, Birds, People, Places and Unexpected Encounters by Gary B. Prescott, the Viking birder. That's at Pangbourne. And their next two field trips also in March, the 19th when they're going to Moor Green, and Tuesday the 21st when they're going to Hotbourne. And Jeremy, who from the local RSPB group Reading, is here tonight and has kindly bought some copies of their latest newsletters. If anybody here in the room would like a copy, there's a pile here, please do come and help yourself. It's the spring and current spring one and the autumn one from last year. You're very welcome. And one last announcement from other groups, that's NDOC. Their next indoor meeting is on Thursday, the 30th of March, so quite a few weeks away yet. And that's on Borneo and Guyana, and it's going to be by Tom Mabbitt of Nature Trek in Greenham. And their next outdoor meeting is much sooner, that's on the 11th of, Saturday the 11th of March, when they go into Poole Harbour, again led by Bob Lyles. Right. Anybody, any other announcements to make, any of the officers or anything? Silence. Right, one last little bit to do before we get started properly then, that's recent sightings. I had a quick look at Berk's birds before I came out. I gather there's been some nice sightings of Hawfinch at Aldermaston for the last week or so. And little owl at Chapel Green. But what else have people been seeing? Right, hand at the back first. We'll start with them. I'll relay them as necessary. Excellent. So that's yellow hammers at, where was that? Sorry? Oh, Park. Yeah, so all right, one male this morning, but yellow hammers at near Park and Wide. Excellent, thank you. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So a couple of stone chats and a Dartford warbler, the first one we've seen there. Where was that? Shinfield? It was a school? Okay. Like near Irish Green, so it's a school in Shinfield if anybody's interested in tracking down a Dartford. Anybody else? Anybody else? Any good recent sightings? Anybody putting their hands up on Zoom? Yeah. Excellent. So that's Firecrest at Streetley still. I think I've seen that one. That's been in the Parks Birds as well for me. And Bob's just saying that you're already getting reports of little winged plovers south of the country and San Martins. So hopefully on our way to us soon. I mean, we're noticing really there's quite a lot of winter visitors still about, but it's been nice to see some of the spring ones coming in. I'm certainly looking forward to it. Another sighting in the room, what have we got? They're already singing? Yeah. Not too much. Yeah. All black caps in one garden, already been waiting for some. Whereabouts is your garden? It's Hampshire, so just outside the county. Oh, just jealous now. Go on. Oh, and a pair of black caps. That's in Caversham, though. That's a bit closer to home. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, another one. Oh, you're doing well this time. You can tell it's getting into spring. Excellent. Another black cap in the garden outside the university campus. I haven't seen any in my garden in Caversham for a few weeks now, but there obviously are quite a few around. Brilliant. And Elaine, go on. What have we got? 30 red kites at food put out in the Cookham Dean garden. My God. Yeah. Wow. And similar at Gillis School. So I think unless there's anything else,
yeah,
I think we should get on with that.
Sally?
Yes,
Sally? Hello?
Hello.
Sally?
Yes, can you hear me, Christina? Yeah?
Yes, yes. We have two grey wagtails visiting our garden every day. We don't have any waterfalls and fast running rivers nearby.
Whereabouts are you?
In Ascot. We have had them before, but I've just seen two, one for week or two, and then two today. They are in the area in a pond that we look after, but to see two is quite encouraging. They may be a pair.
Well, let's keep our fingers crossed, and hopefully you'll have more in the future. Thank you very much for that. Okay, there's somebody else connecting to audio. Is that somebody got a sighting? Okay, let's get on with the main part of the evening then. Before I introduce Paul, who's talking to us remotely this evening, I'm just going to ask him to share his screen and unmute. Then we'll be ready.
That should be okay, is it?
It is indeed, yes.
Yeah.
Change my... Just making sure that the people in the room can see you as well as the people on Zoom. Hopefully that'll be okay there. But tell me if it's not, and I can always move it. Okay, right. I'd like to introduce Paul then. He's Paul Bellamy. He's a senior conservation specialist at the RSPB. He specialises in Lowland Broadleaved, Woodland and Forestry. And his work informs the RSPB land management advice and policy, but also the policy and practices of Defra, the Forestry Commission and National England. So, Natural England. Tonight he's going to be telling us about the pressures affecting woodlands and woodland birds and what's been done to understand and reduce those pressures. But he's also then in the second half going to be talking about some of the particular specific projects. And I think he's going to be covering some priority species, Hawfinch, Lesser Spotted Woodpecker, and Willow Tit. So there's lots of good things to come. So I will pass you over to Paul. Do say if there's any problems with the sound, we can turn the sound up in the room if you need us to. There you go, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Good evening, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. As Sally said, I'm the person in charge of all of the woodland research projects at the RSPB. I've been doing that since 2012, but I've actually been working on woodland birds since about the on and off since the mid-80s, so I've know quite a bit about it. So to start with, I shall tell you how the science fits into RSPB organisation. So I'm in the RSPB's Conservation Science Department, and if any of you are RSPB members, the rebranch gives science as one of the pillars of the RSPB. And the reason for that is that we work with nearly all of the departments within RSPB. So we work with species recovery, and they tell us any problems that they've got. They come to us. We think if there's anything we can do from a science background, see if we can fund research, get back to them. Similar with policy, if there's any policy problems we think can be addressed with science, it comes to us, and then we see whether we can do anything about it. And again, we're reserves and site protection. So we work with all of the other areas of the department and try and provide some evidence to underpin the work they do. But to start with, I'm going to talk to you about general how birds and woodland fit together, and then do some broad research on some of the pressures that they face in the first half. To start with, woodland structure is the most important thing affecting birds in woodland. So whenever anybody researches what affects either individual species or the diversity of species, we always find out that structure is much more important than the types of trees or the types of ground layer and things like that. So the way that structure works is you get different densities in the ground layer, you get different density in the shrub layer, mid-story layers and canopy layers. And the more of these different layers of vegetation you come up through the woodland, the greater the number of species you have. And that's been found throughout the world in all sorts of woodland habitats. And you can see individual species are found in individual parts of the woodland structure. And having diversity of structure vertically through the woodland is important, but also horizontally. So if you get areas that are open and areas that got dense canopy, that's also useful as well. Having said that structure is the most important thing, tree species can also have an effect as well. So we've done some work trying to work out how species are associated with particular trees. The first project on this we did was with ash. When ash dieback came in, we wanted to find out whether it's going to affect any species in particular. So we looked at all of the published research to find out which species use ash and whether they prefer ash to other species. There wasn't many species that were particularly associated with ash. There were 7 that prefer ash, and there was another 5 that use them but are indifferent. So the ash didn't seem to be a particularly important tree species for birds. Having said that, they are important for 1 or 2, like ash can be an important food for bullfinches. The next project we looked at was oak, and there was a lot more species associated with oak. And again, there was 14 species prefer oak. There's a lot more there, twice as many, and 24. And we've got a new project that just started up last year. We're going to be looking at some of the conifer species as well, looking at Scots pine and Sitka spruce. So there is a small effect of tree species on top of the woodland structure. So as with most birds, woodland birds are subjected to declines in populations over the last 30 or 40 years. But this isn't consistent across all of the birds. So we find that the generalists, which are things that are found in woodlands, but also gardens and farmland, things like blue tits, robins, blackbirds, they seem to be doing fine. They just trundle along up and down along the same line. Whereas the specialists, those things that only occur in woodlands, such as the woodpeckers, tree creepers, nuthatches, they are declining. So those are the main species that we're interested in. RSPB has looked at pressures on woodland birds, and we did a review and expert analysis on what sorts of things affect whether woodland bird populations are going up and down. And this bar chart here shows you the blue is things that negatively affect bird populations, and the green is things that positively affect it. And the bigger the bar is, the bigger the effect. So intensive land management has a strong effect on woodland birds. That's the same as all other bird species. So intensive management of land reduces nearly everything. You get a small increase there. But for things I'm going to be concentrating on here are things that we think are particularly affecting woodland birds. So one of them is climate change. In woodland birds, this is largely positive. There's more species that are affected by, more species affected by climate change positively than negatively. But there's some positive and negatives there. And the other area is habitat creation, i.e. woodland planting or creating new woodlands. That tends to be positive for woodland birds, unsurprisingly. But also management, we get a decrease in forest management tends to be negative, and increase in forest management could be negative or positive depending on how it's done. So we'll be looking, in the next section, we'll be looking at habitat creation, climate change and woodland management, and look at the research we've done around this. So woodland management, RSPB has always been interested in woodland management, and in the 70s and 80s there was a lot of work looking at how different species occur in different woodlands and impacts of coppicing, etc., as woodland management changed during the 20th century. And one of the first large-scale projects we looked at was this joint project with Forestry Research, University of Nottingham and BTO, and it was looking at the implications of woodland management and deer on broadleaf woodland. And this involved quite a large field survey. We surveyed lots of woods across southern England and the Welsh Marches. We also did review of the literature on the impacts of deer and deer and management, woodland management. So one of the things we found was that, unsurprisingly, you get different species are associated with different features of the woodland. So woodland type, you get some that are associated with broadleaves, not many that are associated particularly with conifers. Redpoll is the only one of our species there, and there's quite a lot that are just indifferent. They'll be just as happy as in conifers are in broadleaf. So things like redstart and song thrushes, they quite like conifers and broadleaves. And the stage of woodland development. So some things like young woodland, again, there's a load of shrub species here, sort of willow warbler, tree pipits, song thrush, dunnock, that occur in the young woodlands, and mature woodlands, you get another suite of species. And there's not much that likes it varied. So depending on the stage of developing woodland, you'll get a different suite of species. And then there's different factors within the woodland. So how much shrub layer you've got, the type of shrub layer, how much canopy, whether it's open and closed, and whether you've got large trees. These all have an impact on which species you get. So moving on in more detail at the features within the plots. So this is based on the field surveys we did over, I think it was 60 sites with several survey plots within each site across England. We found that tree and shrub diversity, there was bullfinch was positively associated with that. And then when you get tree size and height, so we get things that don't like big trees are nightingale, garden warbler, willow warbler. The things that do like big trees are spotted flycatcher and blackcap. The only thing that's associated with the amount of birch was willow warbler, and then the amount of canopy cover, that affects how much shrub layer you got. So your shrub species don't like to have too many trees, whereas your things that like trees like a better canopy cover, spotted flycatcher. And again, it can be where your shrub layer is, whether it's tall shrub or short shrub, can also affect which species you get. And there's a few species that are also affected by the amount of bare ground you get. So moving on to look at the actual, this is looking at where a review of the literature showing how birds respond to different types of management. So the two things that are most commonly researched are the coppice system and clearfell system. And within that, we looked at what people did within them. So there's harvesting, chopping them down and replanting, and then there's thinning within the clearfell. So that's the thinning out the trees halfway through growth. And so we find out that what happens is within coppice, you get temporary open ground, and that increases the use by tree pipit. And then you get a dense, low, woody vegetation provided, and that improves all of the shrubland species, things like nightingales, wood warblers, garden warblers, etc. Whereas in clearfell, you get the temporary open ground again, which tree pipit and nightjar like. You get the dense shrubby vegetation, which again, we get the shrub species, but this depends on the scale of the intervention. So the larger the area you cut down, you tend to get more shrubby species coming in. Whereas when you do thinning, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of effect. So it doesn't take enough trees out to let much light in to change the to increase the shrub layer. So you don't really get any change in the bird population through thinning. So the main effects that we found were the four big things that seem to be affecting woodland, which birds you get from woodland management is that normal thinning has little effect on birds. Large scale reduction in the tree canopy. This is either coppice or heavy thinning of woodland, which improves the shrub layer. You get a few species which actually prefer the clear fell conifers. You get willow warblers and redpolls. They're much more likely to be found in clear fell conifers than they are in smaller scale habitat management. And the other big thing was providing open space within your woodland so that you get shrubby edges along both within the woodland and on the outside edge of the woodland. So the next bit of work I'm going to talk to you about is the East Midlands Woodland Bird Project, which was based on RSPB and Forestry Commission's guidance on managing woodlands for birds. So between RSPB and Forestry Commission, they published guidance on which types of woodland management should benefit different different bird species. So we thought, well, we'll test this and see whether you can actually improve your bird species you're interested in through management. And the Forestry Commission used the grant system they had for woodland management, and in the East Midlands, they decided they were going to put a certain amount of money into increasing the amount of woodland that was managed for birds. And they employed an advisor who went out to find woodland agents, landowners, estates who wanted to manage their woodland, and then worked with the estate to try and get as much beneficial woodland that would help the woodland species we were interested in. And so we managed to get 9 estates on board with this, and we got 64 sites. Well, there was a lot more than this that actually signed up to the scheme, but we wanted to monitor what the outcome of this was. So we worked with the estates to see whether we could come in and measure what the birds were like before they managed, and then come in several years later and see what happened and whether the birds had increased. So we end up with 64 sites on 9 estates, and these were around the Midlands from the edge of the Peak District down to Rockingham Forest near Peterborough at the bottom here. And 50 of these had woodland management grants and 14 of them didn't. So we had something to compare the woodland management with if you hadn't managed them at all. And the management was carried out in the 5 years between 2010 and 2016. And as we were getting them signed up, we did initial surveys of both the woodland structure and the birds in a selection of these woods. And then we went back in 2019 and redid all of the surveys to see what had changed in the 11 years intervening. So first of all, the woodland structure changed. So yes, tree density had decreased, which you'd expect when you're carrying out a number of things to improve it for birds. The understory had decreased, but then we think that's partly because many of the trees that were removed were the younger trees, which might have had lower canopy. And also when you're doing forestry operations, quite often the smaller shrubs get squashed by felling of trees. So we think that's a temporary thing. We would expect that to increase again after the opening up the canopy. But we did get quite a response of bramble. So bramble did increase, which shows that the light is getting down to the floor of the woodland. So what was the response of the birds? So period 1 is here and period 2 is here, and this is the abundance of birds per point count. So on the managed sites, we had an increase of 78% between the first period and the second period, which on its own, you can't really tell whether that's good or bad because the birds in the general countryside might have increased as well. But when you looked at the unmanaged sites, there'd been a small decrease. So the increase on the managed sites compared with the decrease on the unmanaged suggests that the management actually had a positive effect on the birds it was targeting. Some of the individual target species were also affected positively. That was largely depending on whether there was enough of them to record in good numbers to do any statistical analysis on. And marsh tit was one of the ones that showed quite a strong response there. All of the woodland specialists, if you lump them together, also had a positive effect, whereas there was no real effect on woodland generalists. So those birds that are happy in all sorts of different habitats, they weren't really affected by the woodland management was done. But as you may remember, there was only a small number of woods that weren't managed under this, and this was fewer than we originally thought, because when we went back to quiz the owners about what they'd managed, we found that some of the ones we thought were going to be unmanaged, they had actually managed. So to make sure that this result is reliable, we also measured the change in our target species between the managed sites, but also against measured those against the breeding bird survey squares in the same landscapes and within close proximity. So we looked at any BBS squares that had woodland within 50 kilometres of the sites. We made sure that we only looked at the woodland within these kilometres and within these BBS squares, so we're only comparing like with like. And again, we found a very similar difference with the unmanaged woods within the scheme. The decline was slightly smaller within BBS, but we still had that increase on the managed sites and a decrease within the BBS. So that gives us confidence that this targeted management, where you've got an advisor going in and getting the landowners to manage, particularly for certain species that you're interested in, create the structures and get as much management in as possible, does seem to improve the bird populations, which is very heartening in that as government money's being put into these schemes to try and improve our woodland bird populations. So that work was done under a previous woodland grant, and that was preceded by the Countryside Stewardship, which is the agri-environment scheme that covers all agriculture and woodland. So the second project we did on this, we looked at countryside stewardship across the whole of England, and the squares on this map are the sites that we went out, and so the sort of browny red squares are the ones that we went out and we recorded birds in all of the woodlands that were getting funding for woodland management, and they said they were doing it for birds. And then we compared that with BBS squares, and actually I got that wrong. The blue ones were the ones under woodland management, and the browny red ones were the ones under the breeding bird, BTO breeding bird survey. So we went out to all of the woodland management sites and recorded what birds were there, but we didn't have any before and after for this. We were just looking at what was present and whether it was any different from those in the wider countryside. And again, we found that the WD2, that's the woodland management option. The densities of woodland specialists was higher than on BBS sites. But in this one, we also found that woodland generalists were higher than on the BBS sites. So it does seem that seems to be that managing woodland seems to give you better bird populations than the wider countryside. We also looked at species richness and to see whether you were getting greater variety of species within these woods. And we looked at the regional pool from the BTO Atlas. So we looked at which species you would expect to occur in that area and compared how many of them were occurring within your sites. And again, we found that the managed sites had 60% of the expected species in them, whereas the BBS sets only had about 30% of the total number of species they could have. And it was also higher for all woodland species. So again, they seem to, as well as having a higher number of birds, they also have a higher diversity of birds. So you get a wider variety of birds in these managed woods. And we also looked at what the structure of the woodland was in these, and we found that the abundance of birds, or the diversity of birds, corresponded to the expected relationships to structure in the woods. So the structure that was created from the management seemed to be positive for the birds. So we do think that this difference is actually related to the management that was carried out. And this gives us a baseline so we could monitor this in the future, see whether there's any further changes, because most of these are only a short term after this is only 5 years after the work was carried out, the management was carried out. So we think we'd like to look and see what the longer term changes would be. And all of these options are being brought into the new agri-environment schemes that are being brought in at the moment. So we hope that woodlands will continue to be encouraged to be managed. Moving on now to woodland creation. We did a review of the impacts on biodiversity on woodland creation, and we found that most of the evidence was from upland conifers. This is largely due to the historical problems that upland conifer plantations have caused in the 20th century. So there was a lot of work going to see what happened when you blanketed large areas of the uplands in conifers. And there was relatively few examples that followed changes over time within woodland. So they always compared woodland with unwooded rather than what happened within a wood over time. There's a few specific bits of work that we've done. So RSPB looked at native woodland planting in Highland Scotland. So this is mostly broadleaf woodland on the upland fringes, sort of birch and willow and oak. And we found that things that most affected the number of species you had in your new woodland planting was the amount of woodland in the nearby area. So have you got woodland around the area you're planting up to populate it with woodland birds? So the more woodland you've got around, the more of them will come into your new bit of woodland. And also the age of the woodland plot. So it was only up to about 20 years when most of the plots were. So as it got older, it seemed to be increasing in the number of bird species it had. There was also a strong impact of altitude. So the higher up woods had a lot fewer birds, which is what you'd expect because there's fewer resources and they're more battered by winds and things when you get up too high. So it seems that putting new woodland into a well-wooded area seems to be the best, as well as having it lower down in the hill. And Lowland Broadleaved plantations, there's been some work done on this as well. This is not RSPB's work, but we're involved in the people that are the project to some extent, in that we're involved in one of the PhD students. And we found that in the Lowland Broadleaf plantations, the only woodland specialists that appeared frequently at all were chiffchaff and blackcap, and that was looking at plantations up to 80 years old. So it seems that to benefit woodland birds, you have a long time span before you get the woodland specialists coming into these new woodlands. So we think it's going to be 100 to 200 years before we start getting woodland populations that are similar to long-term established woodlands or ancient woodlands. And all of these younger woodlands, less than 100 years, were dominated by woodland generalists. So again, all of this tree planting there's going to be quite a long time delay before we see benefits for woodland birds, and particularly the specialists. There's been a lot less done on lowland natural regeneration. This is a project I've been involved with for about 30 years, which is looking at two areas that have been left to develop naturally against an ancient woodland. The first was the 60-year-old was a barley field that was abandoned in the 1960s, and it now looks like a woodland anywhere else, medium-aged woodland, and it started to get a few woodland specialists in it. There was woodpecker breeding in there great spotted woodpecker breeding in there last year. And then the other site, it's about a kilometre away on the edge of the same ancient woodland, and it's about 25 years old, and it's dominated by shrubs at the moment, blackthorn, hawthorn, with young oaks, birch, elm and field maple in it. And this is particularly populated by lots of warblers, so good numbers of willow warblers, garden warblers, whitethroats, etc., with not many of your woodland specialists coming in until it gets much older. Moving on now to climate change. We saw the extreme effects last summer. This was a wildfire that occurred on one of the RSPB reserves last year. But by and large, climate change has a positive effect on woodland birds. One of these is this is typified by the nuthatch, which previously was strongly influenced by hard winters. So there's quite a lot of small woodland birds were low survival in hard winters, stop their numbers increasing. And the increasingly mild winters and very few hard frosts in recent years means they expand. And so we've seen them expanding from the first BTO atlas. They were largely a southern England species. And then by the second atlas, they'd filled out through much of England. The range had filled out through much of England. And then by the last atlas, they'd moved up through southern Scotland, and they're now halfway up through the Highlands. So they've completely shifted their range northwards. We see that there's a large area on the east coast here where there's still not many nuthatches. That's because there's not enough woodland there. So nuthatch is a species that doesn't like to fly open spaces. So areas where woodland is sparse, i.e. Cambridgeshire, Lincolnshire and East Yorkshire, you don't get many nuthatches. And B2 again have done some work looking at which species are affected by the range expansion, and there's more species increasing the range northwards. So we get chiff chaff, green woodpecker, great spotted woodpecker, jay, nuthatch, all increase their range northwards, with relatively fewer decreasing at the south end of the range. Willow warbler and probably willow tit are the main species. This is a common theme in that birds populations that are gradually getting worse conditions tend to hang on for longer, even though in the longer term they're probably going to die out. So many of our isolated small willow tit populations will probably disappear in the not too distant future. Another thing that's often talked about in climate change is food mismatch, i.e. whether the appearance of caterpillars is becoming earlier than the birds can change their breeding season. So the caterpillars come out earlier, the trees leaf earlier, but the birds don't breed as early as the caterpillars. So the caterpillars peak comes through before the birds use it. And there's been quite varied results on this. There's been a few high profile papers that have shown that there has been an effect, particularly on pied flycatchers, although there are quite a lot of other pied flycatcher studies that have found no effect of it. So it seems to be that might only be a site-specific effect. Quite a few other species we've looked at, you do get a decrease in caterpillars but it doesn't seem to have an effect on the breeding success. So wood warblers are a case in point. So if the caterpillars run out, they just switch food and start eating flies and spiders and other things instead. So there's quite a few species that seem to be able to just switch their diet and eat other things instead of caterpillars and continue to breed fairly successfully. So there may be some effect of this food mismatch, but it's by no means universal or severe. So I've come to an early break now. Welcome back. So now I'm going to go through 3 species projects, which are going to be Hawfinch, Lesser Spotted Woodpecker, and then a bit on Willow Tit and Marsh Tit. So start with, we started working on Hawfinch about 2012 to try and work out why they're declining. So there's been quite a big decrease in Hawfinch breeding range. So there's probably about 70% decrease in range since the first breeding atlas, and they're now restricted to a few main areas like the New Forest, Forest of Dean and Wye Valley and North Wales, and then a few other scattered populations around. So we mostly work in the Forest of Dean and the Wye Valley and in the Dog Echo area, with another bit of work in the New Forest. That's more recent. So the first thing that we thought was wrong with it, the first reason we thought for population decline was poor breeding success, because people had noticed that recent breed nest records have been very low breeding success. So we decided we were going to try and work out if there was any indication that there was poor breeding success and what was the cause of this. Quite difficult to find Hawfinch nests, because they nest in a very wide range of locations, and they can be very well hidden. So to make sure we had a representative sample of nests, rather than easy ones that you can find, which are the ones that are usually monitored, we started catching females and attaching radio transmitters to them, and then we followed them around until they seemed to be settled in particular trees. So if they kept going back to the same tree, then we thought there's probably going to be a nest there. So first of all, you catch your Hawfinches, attach a small radio transmitter to them, then follow them around, and try and find where each one is every day or every few days. And then once you've found your nest trees, you then got to look for a nest, and this can take anything from a day to a week to actually find the nest within the tree, even though you know which tree it is, and you can hear the bird bleeping up there, because often they're hidden away. This one is just in the fork of that tree there, so that's just a view of it from above. And the sorts of places they nest could be either 2 meters up in a bit of honeysuckle, or it could be on the end of a branch in a 30-meter beech tree. And some of the nests we couldn't actually get to and couldn't reach. So once we found our nests, we need to monitor them. So we started thinking we could monitor them with nest cameras, and we thought because a lot of them are very high up, we needed climbers to get up to the nest. So we need to some colleagues in the Forestry Commission to help us with this. In the end, we only got a small number of nests up, cameras up to follow them, but we did get some useful information. We also found that the birds were quite susceptible to disturbance. So we actually lost a couple of nests when we first tried it, so we abandoned it for that year, had to think about what was going on, and then retried and used it successfully in the other years. So you have to be careful how you approach the nest and where you put the camera. And we did discover the main predators of nests. So there were mostly jays, woodpeckers, buzzards, with a few goshawks, and other sparrowhawks and things like that. So in the end, we monitored most of the birds from the ground, and we just used the birds' behavior as an indication of what was going on in the nest. So we could tell when they were on eggs, because the female would be sitting tight and we could hear it bleeping, and the male would come in and feed her on the nest. And then once the young were hatched, the female came off a bit more frequently, and then once the chicks were larger, you could sometimes see the chicks with their heads coming over the edge of the nest. And because a lot of the areas were on strong slopes, you could actually, some of the ones you could go up slope and look into the nest as well. So we could get quite good indication of what was going on in the nest, even though we couldn't always tell how many eggs or chicks they had. So what we found out from quite a few years of looking for nests, I think it was took us about 4 years to get enough data to analyse. And we found that 36% of nests fledged young. And when compared to other open cup nesting finches, this is sufficient to maintain populations. And on the few nests we did get brood sizes, now they tended to fledge 3 or 4, and actually not many of the nests had complete predation. Quite often something would come in and take one chick or one egg, but the adults are very good at protecting the nest, and they can quite often chase a woodpecker or a sparrowhawk away. So there was one nest which a goshawk came and took one chick and got chased off by a hawfinch. So we didn't think that nest success in these core populations was actually a problem, but we compared it with the historical record from the Nest Record Scheme, the BTO Nest Record Scheme, and we found that the nest success rate from the Nest Record Scheme was much lower. It was just nearly 21% compared to the Hawfinch project, which was 36%. So the nests that were found through Nest Records were obviously more susceptible to loss. We looked at what nest success was related to. We found that it declined over the years. So prior to 1980, it was quite good, but then it's decreased quite a lot in more recent years. And also there was a decrease in nest success with nest height. So from the Nest Record Scheme, it seemed to suggest that higher nests were failing compared to the lower nests. But it's quite difficult to untangle this, because when we looked at whether nest height had changed over time, we find that yes, the more recent nests are in, and more recently found nests are much higher. And here the blue dots are from our Hawfinch project, the ones we found from radio tracking, compared to the squares, which were the ones from the rest of the record. So obviously our nests cover a much higher range, because we weren't just looking for them from the ground. We were using radio tags, so we could find all of the hidden nests as well as the exposed nests. But it does seem that they did used to nest a lot lower, even within the Nest Record Scheme data. So there seems to be an increase in nest height over time. So we think what might be happening here is that there used to be a fairly widespread species of the wider countryside and be found in orchards and hedgerows, whereas now they're restricted to largely wooded areas. So the nests we find now are all in woodland compared to farmland and orchards where they were found before. So after we found that there was no current problem with nest success, we decided to see whether there was anything within the habitat use that was a problem. So to do this, we put a different tag on our birds. This was a GPS tag, which recorded where the birds were every half hour or 1 hour, and find out how they moved across the landscape to see whether changes in the landscape could be affecting them. And the first thing we found was they were very mobile. So this picture, this map here, shows a bird over 6 days, and it's traveling around the landscape using lots of different woodlands on different days. And after tracking lots of these birds, we find that they just use the whole landscape as their foraging range. So they can fly 20 kilometers in a day, no problem, and they'll just go from one area to another, depending on what trees are seeding at the time. And we found that individuals ranged sort of about 24 hectares and could be from 200 to 500 hectares, depending on when the nest hang. So if they're on the nest, they didn't really travel far, but once they'd finished, they actually, first of all, just gradually moved across the landscape with their young, and then when the young were independent, they carried on moving around all over the place. So we did that in the breeding season, and we also did it in winter. In winter, they ranged more widely, but quite often they stayed in the same place for quite a long time, and then just moved large distance to another area. And this is an urban area where they were using a feeder in this garden, so they just spent a lot of time in this garden, sitting in the trees around where there was a feeder in the winter. And they similar range from sort of 10 to 500 hectares. Individuals ranged over with an average of about 81 hectares. So yes, they're using large areas of the landscape to find their food, both in summer and in winter. So what were they looking for within that habitat? So we looked at the different habitats that we were actually using, and this lists the main habitats within the study area, and the available is how much of that habitat was in the study area, and then the summer locations and winter locations, that's how many times the bird was found to be within that habitat. So spend a lot more time in broadleaf woodland than you'd expect from the amount of habitat available, which is not surprising for a woodland bird. And then consequently a lot less in other habitats. So they don't seem to particularly like conifer that much. Broadleaf woodland is where they are. But in winter, they tended to use suburban urban areas more as well. So we think this is related to using bird feeders in gardens in winter. And then which features of the habitat? So we, as well as just looking at what the habitats were there, we went out and recorded a sample of the locations. We recorded lots of different features of the habitat, and to see which areas they were selecting for. So woodland hedge seems to be important. So they seem to be foraging near edges, both in summer and in winter. And we think one reason for this could be that it gives them a good view. So they can they're quite a sociable species, and they like to sit up high and look out on places. Also, trees on the edge tend to have a greater amount of foliage because they get more light, and they can also have greater seed and flower crops as well. So think of shrubs that are on the edge. You quite often get a lot of blackthorn flower and things like that on the edge. So it might be more flower and fruit on the edge as well. In summer, they avoided recent management. We're not quite sure why that is. It just might be that the younger woods are more likely to be managed, and they weren't particularly liking those ones. And then in winter, they also didn't like much field vegetation. So they seem to be found in areas where less field vegetation. That's because in winter, they often feed on the ground, whereas in the summer, they feed in the tree canopy. So they like to have a sort of fairly bare ground so they can come down and collect the fallen seed. Both summer and winter, they look for areas with beech trees. So they're more likely to be found when there were beech trees. And in summer, they're also cherries and rowans, or more likely to find where there was cherries and rowans. But birches they avoided. They avoided birches, so there doesn't seem to be any interest in anything within birch trees. So this sort of gave us an indication of what they were using in the habitat and the scale of the habitat, the scale of use of the habitat. So this can give us a clue as to how we would need to manage. So there's obviously no way you can manage for this bird at a reserve scale. You have to manage at a landscape scale, but it gives you an idea of things that you'd need to include within that landscape. So the next thing we did was to see what they were eating, whether they were actually specialising in certain things. So we had a PhD student who went round to all of the Hawfinch ringers and collected lots of poo samples. So as they caught a bird, they put it inside a paper bag and you leave it there for a few minutes and they invariably give you a nice sample. And you've got a nice clean paper bag, so you can scoop it out and put it into your tube and freeze it for later analysis. And our student Ewan, he did lots of complicated DNA analysis on this, which I don't really understand, but he came out with a nice long list of things that hawfinches were eating and a bit of variation in what they were eating where. So to start with, the plants, we know that they feed on mostly tree species. We know that they feed on a lot of tree seed. So most of the plants they ate were trees. So 42 different tree species were identified, 17 shrubs and 19 ground flora. The ground flora was a surprise because we didn't really know that they fed on things on the ground. We thought when they were feeding on the ground, they would be feeding on fallen tree seed, but they were feeding on things like chickweed, fat hen, things that other farmland finches feed on, and nettle as well. So holly was a common species, and cherry. So what were the most common of these species? So most common tree species, these were all occurred in more than 20% of the samples that we collected. So oak, beech, hornbeam. So these are hornbeam and beech have long known to be good food sources for hawfinches. So this is telling us largely what we knew before, but we didn't know that there was a strong use of oak because they don't really have seeds that they eat. So we think they're using the buds and flowers of oak because they don't only feed on the seeds of trees, they also feed on flowers and buds. And again, in beech, in the breeding season, they're feeding a lot on beech. So we think they're taking the flowers and the buds of beech in the spring as well. And sunflower was no surprise because we catch hawfinches by putting sunflower seeds down as bait within the woodland. So we could also, by using the occurrence of different tree species in the woods, so we recorded which trees were a sample of locations within our woods. We compared with what they were eating compared with the tree, how frequently the trees were found in the woods, and we could tell whether they were preferentially feeding on particular species. So here we have a list of trees down the side, and along the bottom is a measure of whether they're using it in greater frequency than expected along the positive side here, or a lower frequency than expected along the negative side here. And the two dotted lines is roughly using it in proportion to the frequency that the trees are in the woodlands. So most trees, they just eat them if they come across them, but there's a few species which they strongly prefer. So cherry, beech and hornbeam, they're seeking those out and eating them much more frequently than they occur within the landscape. And the things that they avoid are things like ash, hazel and birch. So we know that there are some preferential tree species there, so that if you want to create a landscape that's good for hawfinches, you can boost those tree species within the landscape by planting more of them, particularly along edges. So invertebrates, we know that most woodland birds feed their chicks on caterpillars, but we didn't really know much more about the diversity of invertebrates in the diet. And we've had 113 species within the diet. And again, these were mostly moths and butterflies, which they presume they're feeding on caterpillars, but they also had spiders, flies and mollusks within there. So what are the main things that they were eating? As expected, they were mostly eating caterpillars, which is what they feed their chicks on. But surprisingly, St. Mark's fly and tree slug were in there as very common things to be in the diet. We had no idea they were feeding on these. St. Mark's flies occur on woodland edges in wet grassland, and they're fairly slow flying creatures. So we think probably in wet weather, when caterpillars are difficult to find, they're going to the woodland edges and feeding on St. Mark's fly when they're in, because they fly in May time, so that coincides with the breeding season. And tree slug, again, they're quite common within woodlands, and in wet weather they'll come out and be much more obvious. So we think these are alternative food supplies when caterpillars are difficult to find in poor weather. So we don't think there's particularly a problem with the diet, because they're feeding on things that are fairly widespread, and we've got no indication that diet is a problem there either. So the next thing we're going to start looking at is disease. As with other finches, hawfinches get trichomonas, and in one of our study areas we've had a couple of serious outbreaks, including last year when there was an outbreak in the breeding season, and we had to put a press release out to try and get people to stop feeding, and our research was suspended for several weeks to try and halt the spread of the disease. So we've got a student working on this, and he's going to be going around all of the study areas this year and taking samples of the birds to find out which strains of the trichomonas pathogen are within them, because some are more lethal than others. So we'll get find out how common the lethal strain is within them and how widespread it is across all of the different study areas. So he's hopefully going to North Wales, the Wye Valley and Forest Dean and down to New Forest. So it seems that disease could be an upcoming problem, particularly if they're feeding in gardens. So the study area that I showed you the maps of, with them feeding in gardens, is a study area that had the trichomonas outbreak, and we haven't seen as much of it in other study areas that are mainly in woodland areas. But we think that with hawfinch, the historical declines may have been due to the changes in the wider countryside, making it less attractive for hawfinches to breed in, and they're now occurring in these well-wooded areas where they seem to be doing reasonably well. And we've now got some information we can use to actually manage the landscape at the scale that's needed, so we can make sure they have the right tree species in the right locations. So we'll move on now to Lesser Spotted Woodpecker. So Lesser Spotted Woodpecker nest quite high up, and typically when we want to monitor them, we have a telescopic pole with a remote camera at the top that we can poke in the hole. So we can do quite a bit of nest recording for Lesser Spotted Woodpeckers by standing on the ground and peering at a screen from a camera that's at the top of the pole. So we did quite a bit of work a few years ago looking at where they nest and how well they're breeding. So they seem to have seem to prefer different tree species for nesting in. They always nest in deadwood, and they prefer oak, alder, birch and beech. And they also tend to nest fairly high up in the canopy. So they tend to nest in the top quarter of the, or third of the tree. So they tend to be high up nesters. And they also seem to forage in the top of the canopy. So they forage in the top or the top or the outer edge of the canopy. And again, we were interested in breeding success for Lesser Spotted Woodpecker. So we found in a detailed study in the wire forest that only 59% of the nests fledged at least one chick, whereas in a comparable study area in Sweden, about 80% were fledging at least one chick. And the nests were only producing on average 1.5 chicks, compared with 3.5 chicks in Sweden. So that gave us an indication that breeding success seems to be a real problem in this study area. And partly it seemed to be due to poor weather and inability of the males to bring enough food in to keep the chicks going. So after this, we worked with Ken Smith to set up citizen science project to try and increase the amount of nest recording done, because when we looked at what happened since the RSPB study, very few Lesser Spotted Woodpeckers nests get reported, and in the nest record scheme there's 1 or 2, if any, in any 1 year. So we try to increase the amount of citizen science nest recording done by providing guidance on how to find nests, and we have the nest finding equipment, so we can either lend this out or go and visit nests when people find an active nest. So through this we've increased the numbers of nest monitor year to sort of 10 to 20 a year. So Ken and Linda Smith compiled all of the data from both the nest record scheme, the RSPB earlier project, and the more recent woodpecker network data. And they found that pre-1980, nest survival and young fledge was good, equivalent to what was found in Sweden. But more recently, the numbers of young being fledged has been much lower than expected, but they weren't as bad as we first thought in that project in the wire forest. So we still think that nest success is a problem. We think that food supply is the reason that they're not breeding. They're not able to bring enough food in late in the season. So we set up a project in 2021 to see whether we could find out a bit more about what's causing this food supply and the nest, how food supply is affecting nest success. And we're going to do this by providing supplementary food, i.e. fat blocks, within the territories prior to breeding, so that the birds were in better condition. So we created this gadget which has got a camera on one end, a fat block on the other end. We hoisted these up into tree canopies in lesser spotted woodpecker territories. So the feeders were very successful. They were used within a few days of being put up, and we had a long list of species used them, but not lesser spotted woodpecker. This was despite them being in the good locations for lesser spots. So we saw lesser spots drumming in the same tree just above the feeder, and we had once we found nests, we switched to using mealworms to see whether we can get them to take mealworms, but again they just flew straight past them and ignored them. So we decided that that's a no-goer. So we spent all year last year, but we did find quite a few nests, and 6 nests were found. 1 failed, and 3.4 fledged per successful nest. So again, we seem to be a good breeding season last year. Just to give you an example of what it looks like monitoring one of these nests, I'll show you a video of a nest recording event. So this is just the camera going on the pole going up towards the nest hole, and it waves around trying to get in. Right, it goes in, and then you can see the number, you can see the young in there. And if you use a video, you can see how they move around. So you can usually count how many there and identify whether they're the male or female. It's much easier to record the eggs because they're all very clear at the bottom. They're never covered. But when you get a pile of chicks, it's sometimes difficult to disentangle how many there are there. And then, just trying to get the camera out again, and then back down. So we've called a halt on that experiment, and we've gone back to the drawing board to see what we can do to. We think we might be able to try and set up more citizen science nest monitoring to find out if we can record what birds are bringing into nests and how often they're feeding as well. Moving on to marsh and willow tit now. I'll just do a bit of comparison between the two to start with, and then go a bit more about some of the more recent projects on willow tit. So a lot's been written about distinguishing marsh and willow tit, and it's not often you see both of them in the hand. So we've got marsh tit on my left and willow tit on my right. The white spot in the bill is one key characteristic which isn't always easy to tell in the field, but the other thing is the back of the neck and the ear covers. They're a different colour in marsh tit, whereas it tends to be fairly even across the area on willow tit. That's the other thing to look out for. But they have very different habitat requirements. So marsh tit is a mature woodland species. It likes a good understory and diverse shrub layer, whereas willow tit tends to be in young woodland, often wet, and it can be conifer or broadleaf. Again, their distribution is very different as well. Marsh tit is basically a lowland temperate woodland species, so it comes across sort of central and western Europe, whereas willow tit tends to be a more alpine and boreal species. So the hotspots are across Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and in the Alps and Carpathians in Romania, with much lower densities in the lowland areas. So we've done some work on marsh tit dispersal. So this was a long-term project that Rich Broughton and I worked in when I was at CEH, and we did ringed lots of nestling marsh tits within Woodwood and found out where they ended up. Mostly they stayed within the same wood. They didn't move woods very often, and they tended to end up breeding less than a kilometre from where they were hatched. So dispersal seemed to be a problem for marsh tits. We don't have similar data for willow tits, but we do have a few bits of information about willow tit movement. So both marsh tits and willow tits we've radio tracked to see how they move around the landscape and what their home ranges are. And willow tits seem to be able to move around quite a lot between patches. So this is one unpaired bird that was followed over 3 days, and it moved over several kilometres using different patches. So it was caught in the morning over here near a sewage works. In the afternoon it come over to a young plantation in the middle here. The next day it was up on some young woodland on a old tip here, and then spent most of the day up there. And the following day it came down to a bit along an old railway lane down the bottom for the morning, and then went back up there in the afternoon. So it seems to be quite capable of moving around the landscape and using different patches of habitat. And we found that even birds that seem to be settled, they will regularly travel a kilometre between patches every day, just forage. And we've had some colouring birds in Cumbria which have been noted to breed in one patch and then spend the winter 3 or 4 kilometres away in another site, and then come back and breed again the following year back in its original place. So they seem to be able to move around the landscape a bit more than marsh tits. So look at how much area they need to use. So the average area that a marsh tit uses in winter is about 8.5 hectares, whereas the average a willow tit uses in winter is about 3.5 hectares. So a marsh tit uses a larger area, but it doesn't move around much. So willow tit can move around and make use of much smaller areas, but different patches. And so the range of areas that marsh tits use, so they can use as little as 2.5, but up to about 15. Whereas willow tits, it's about 2 to 7 hectares as the range of foraging areas that they use in winter. So I'll now move on to some work we're doing to try and work out how to help willow tits. So we think that habitat is one of the things that is affecting willow tit declines. So the habitat, so the damp scrubby habitat is disappearing, and is partly through lack of management and turning to woodland, and partly through climate change and things drying out. So we wanted to see whether we could actually revert young woodland to scrub, basically. So we set up this project in 2014. We went out to a whole load of sites around the Midlands and South Yorkshire, and we found sites that had willow tits on them and people were willing to manage them. And we had one site that we provided a management plan for, and another site which we did nothing at. So we had pairs of sites that we can compare what happened to the willow tits in the habitat. So this is an example of one of the sites. So we've got 2 patches here. The yellow patches is where we're going to manage. And we recorded willow tits on those sites, which are the red dots. All of the numbers are where we went round surveying. So we surveyed the whole of this blue circle here, looking for any habitat and playing tapes to see whether we get a response of willow tits. And then the red dots are where the willow tits were found. We also recorded the habitat on the sites in quite detail, and also recorded what the habitat was like within a 1 kilometre radius around the site. We then produced a management plan, working with the site managers to design bits of habitat management that we think will make it better for willow tits. So the sorts of things are taking out trees along edges to create scrubby edges. And this is an example. So we set up and say this area here, we want to take out the large trees along the bottom to reduce shading and create some nest stumps. And we clear 80% of the trees along the stream, so we get some more scrubby areas there, and then clear a 50-metre strip along the edge, so we've got a linking bit between the two areas. So what does willow tit management, habitat management look like? So one of the things is felling along edges, so we can create scrub. Glades within woodland, so just chop down the large area within the woodland. Creating nest stumps, so chopping down the trees so they're up about waist to chest height, so that these can rot and provide nesting sites for willow tits. Or rotational scrub management to stop the scrub becoming too tall. Does it work? Well, we went back last year to record it. I haven't had a chance to look at the data yet, but the visual impressions from the surveyor that went out in the field was that it was very variable. So it seems to be that you need to manage quite large areas to create good habitat. So if you make small glades, it doesn't really affect the habitat at all. You need to clear quite large areas, and it works better if you're managing scrub than it does if you're chopping down trees, because you get a lot of tree regrowth. So it's like opposing, and it grows back to tall trees much quicker when you're managing woodland. The stumps, we could find quite a lot of the stumps that were created. Some areas they tend to disappear. We think that's people foraging for firewood. And we measured the rot score. So we measured how rotten the wood was to see whether we think it's going to be suitable. So some of them had rotted enough to be suitable for nest sites, but I can't tell you the proportions yet because I haven't looked at this at all. So, well, I'll finish there and just say that all of this is a huge effort by lots of people. So we're funded, a lot of it's funded by Natural England through Action for Birds in England, a scheme that's joint RSPB, BT, Natural England funding. We've had money from the Heritage Lottery Fund, money from Defra through Forestry Commission. We've got loads of landowners and organisations that have been involved in the projects, as well as volunteers that have helped with the data collection analysis, and a long list of contract field workers that have done the data collection over the years. So I'll just say thank you and open it up for questions there.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. I found an absolutely fascinating insight into woodlands and some of the birds and the complexity of the whole thing. But also I found really interesting the different range of techniques that people are using for this kind of research. I mean, you know about things like radio tracking, but I confess that the poo in the paper bag was a new approach to me. Can I ask you just to stop sharing your screen so we could see the whole Zoom picture?
Yeah. There we go. Hopefully that's gone away now.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? A hand up in here. I'll have to relay to you so you can help. You can hear it. Carry on. So, question about beavers, I believe. I don't know if you could hear that at all, Paul, but firstly, it said thank you very much, but also wanted to know whether the reintroduction of beavers may help that willow tits by changing the habitat. Would that be a fair way of summarising it? Yeah.
Well, the answer is it might do. We've got no, so this is something that we've got quite a lot of discussion about at the moment. The main problem that we've got in trying to get any evidence for it at the moment is that where people are introducing beavers tends not to be where willow tits are. So at the moment we haven't got any means of doing it, but as the numbers of beaver introductions increases, there may get more overlap. Currently, the only area that's overlap beavers and willow tits is down in the southwest in Devon, and there was one enclosed beaver introduction there that they'd recorded the birds as well as all of the habitat, and they did find that willow tits moved into that area, but that's one site, so it's possible, but we don't really have the evidence yet. So it's a case of watch this space and see what happens as beaver reintroductions become more widespread. But we are thinking about how we can gather that evidence in future.
Are they in the chat? Would you like to? Actually, tell you what, let me see if I can bring the chat up there. Right, so can you see the chat yourself, Paul?
I can indeed, yes.
So for the people in the room, if you can't read it, quality of wood that is likely to change and decrease the effects of ash dieback, horse chestnut, by various other diseases. How might this affect future results of future exercises such as this?
So, yeah, so the bit I showed you about tree associations was particularly to do with ash dieback and oak diseases, looking at whether the loss of particular trees will affect it, and whether but because birds aren't particularly fussy about tree species, it doesn't directly affect it, but there's likely to be an indirect effect through the loss of canopy, and that will open up and you'll get a growth. We expect there to be an increase in the growth of the shrub layer, so that could well affect the species. So it could be similar to managing woodland. You're opening it up a bit more. We haven't currently got any projects working on this, but I know there's some surveillance going on as ash dieback progresses, and it may be that we can go back in a few years' time and have a look and see what has happened to some of these woods that we've worked in previously. Horse chestnut is not really a woodland species, so it doesn't affect woodland birds, and the only thing I know about it is that blue tits love to excavate the grubs out of the leaves. But I don't think that would, but we are very aware of tree diseases affecting changes in woodland structure and woodland species, and one thing that we do think is possibly having an effect is the felling of larch in the west of the country, where there's a phytophthora species that affects larch, and there's quite a lot of felling of larch, and that's very important for quite a lot of finch species. So that might be a negative effect in the future.
I've got another question in the room.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell you what? Come, rather than me try and depict it all, we'd like to come down here and then you be closer to the mic. Yeah. Are you sure? Just if you just stand here, you should be able to. Paul should be able to hear you better.
Yeah,
rather than me
Can I sit there?
Yes, I think.
Right.
As long as Paul can hear you, okay.
Okay. Lucky I've got quite a. Yeah, just work for Forestry. What we're trying to do is integrate.
I think you might need to speak closer into the microphone. I can't really.
Well, yeah, try. Well, come, if you stand where I am, or sit where I am.
Okay, I'll
Try
do that.
that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So a landscape woodland design advisor for Forestry Commission, and we're trying to well, we're looking at integrated design. And so what struck me of the four species you've just been talking about, the edge and open woodland seems to be particularly important. but I grew up in Surrey, and we had both Hawfinch and woodpeckers garden. And it was at a time when there was very low predation pressures because of management and sparrows. And I'm also very aware that in the southeast there's a huge increase in recreational activity, the sort of woodlands where you would have once got hawfinches. So I think my question is my question. I'm interested. I know it's a difficult one, perhaps the RSPB, but I'm interested in the sort of the potential design of woodlands. So you kind of slightly zone it, or you kind of have areas that are designed so there's less recreation. But also, I think you need very complex woodlands so that predator pressure can be, if you like, it makes it, the whole structure is more complex, and therefore the population is more resilient to predators. So I'm kind of slightly thinking aloud. Is there anything there?
Yeah. So it was, if I understood it right, there's two things. There's predation and disturbance. Was that right?
Yeah, but I guess it's related to this more open woodland. And
yeah. So yeah, so the thinking is that when you get a more complex structure with woodland edges and more open woodland, you tend to get greater protection from predation. But whenever we've looked at predation, we've looked at this in quite a lot of species. It tends not to be a population problem. So the rates of predation, in particular, we don't know about the adults, predation rates on adults, but predation rates on nests doesn't seem to be a problem in the species we've looked at. So we've looked at quite, what have we looked at? Pied flycatchers, wood warblers, willow tits, hawfinches. So we've all done quite a lot of nest monitoring, and the nest success of these seems to be fairly good, and predation doesn't seem to be a problem. It occurs, but it's not at a level that actually is going to cause any population problems. So we're not too worried about nest predation. But disturbance is a different thing. So we think there could well be effects of disturbance on people. There's been quite a few studies on the continent suggesting that low-level recreation disturbance can affect nesting densities quite strongly. So birds just don't bother nesting if there's too many people around. So they just go somewhere else, basically.
I think that's reflected in the distribution of hawfinch. The core areas are very extensive areas of the forest.
Yeah.
Where you're going to get this recreational disturbance, whereas southeast.
Yeah. So we haven't looked in many ways, but it's also good. Yeah. So we haven't really done much work yet, but we know it's a potential problem, and there's a lot of internal discussions on how we manage that, particularly on reserves, and thinking about sort of, we've known it's been a problem on shorebirds and things, but we now know it's a much more widespread problem. So we are thinking about how to zone things. And but yes, the problem of development increasing population pressure, we don't really know, and there's probably not much you can do about it, unless you create different planning laws that provide more recreational areas within developments.
I'm just conscious of the time. Thank you very much, Paul. I think we've got one more question in the chat.
Yes, I've got that. That was in a graph. So I've got the other graph up, the particular graph. So what I'm going to do is share that briefly and explain it in more detail. It was remiss of me to so
about 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Wrap up, I'm afraid.
So-
I hate doing this. But,
So this graph along the top is the number of birds that fledged young. Along the bottom is the number of birds that nests that didn't fledge young. And this line through the middle is actually the modelled response. So that's giving you a proportion. So giving you an estimate of how many nests will succeed at different times. So it's using the succeeded and didn't succeed, and there's a statistical analysis that gives you a probability across a whole range, and it's the same for here. So these are the ones that succeeded and the ones that didn't, and then at different nest heights, and there's the modelled response, so the likelihood of succeeding at different nest heights. So hopefully that will explain that.
Thank you very much, Paul. Right, I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap it up here. As much as I hate to do that, I found it really interesting, and obviously from the there was a lot of detail, but really well worthwhile. Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Thank you.
On the
Right, I'd just like to very quickly remind you that the next meeting is 2 weeks' time, is the photographic competition. 2 days left to send in entries. Please do, the more the merrier. Well, I'm not sure Jane will thank me for that. And I hope to see you there. See you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Goodbye.